Hello viewers, yet another report is out on the widening divide between the rich and poor. It's brought out by Oxfam and is titled The Survival of the Richest. The statistics is mind-boggling, both for our country and also for the world. For example, in India, the number of persons who go to bed without food, in hunger, has increased from 19 crore to 35 crore in the last 3-4 years. And at the same time, 60 more Indians became billionaires. We have with us the CEO of Oxfam India, Amithabh Behar. Welcome, Amit.
Thank you, Jimmy.
As I said, the statistics which you have brought out, your organization has brought out, is alarming, at least I will say. For example, about India, 20 billionaires have the same wealth as 70 crores of Indians. And in the last 1 decade, 1% of the people got hold of the new wealth creator, 50% of the new wealth creator. And if you take from 2020, this 1% got hold of the 75% of the wealth created. What baffles me is that, okay, rich getting richer, we know that. But even during pandemic, the multi-billionaires were amassing a lot of wealth. You know, the story of Adani becoming the third richest in the whole world. How is that possible?
Thank you, Jimmy, for inviting me. And just to, as you said, the numbers are mind-blowing. They're staggering. And I must say also alarming. And let me just add a couple of more numbers to what you've just talked of, because I think it's critical that in India, just the top 1% actually hold 40% of Indian wealth, whereas the bottom 50% control only 3% of wealth. So, that is the disparity that I think is very critical, and which becomes even more stark when you look at the numbers. 21 billionaires have more wealth than 70 crore of the Indian population, which is pretty much, as I've been now saying, put 21 people, they would not even occupy a minibus completely. And they have more wealth than 50% of now probably the most populous country. As we know that in the last couple of days, we have probably overtaken China also. So this is both, I would say, staggering, dramatic, but also hugely, hugely concerning. The other data that you talked of, I think that's also very important, which is around the newly created wealth. In the last 1 decade, the newly created wealth, 2/3 of that globally, 50% of that globally went to the top 1%. In the last 2-3 years, it's been post-pandemic, 75% of that went to the top 1%. But in India, I'm repeating that because the India numbers are slightly different. In India, top 1% cornered 40% of the newly created wealth. So what we're clearly looking at is a system which is rigged in favor of the super rich. And whatever wealth is being created keeps getting accumulated at the top. I think that's really the story of our report. That there are different ways where, for instance, you asked me the reasons. Let me give you one very concrete reason. The corporate tax being reduced. And the government said these are incentives to the corporate sector. Eventually, I think what the paradigm is that you give relief to the corporate tax. That's what is being stated. And then there's going to be greater money being generated by the corporates, which will trickle down. And that's what we are not looking at. So, this myth of trickle down needs to be called out, because we've seen that that's not happened. And since the 90s, you're looking at only growing inequality.
But how come during the pandemic also, these people were making a lot of money? Because we thought that in the pandemic, everything was shut shop.
Yeah, but if you also see that during the pandemic, you also saw a lot of new vaccine billionaires come in, because whatever wealth was being created during this time was getting cornered by the top few people. Last year we did a report that a large number of these billionaires actually came from the medical and the pharma sector. So the new wealth gets accumulated there. The second is, this is also the time where we've seen a huge spurt of cronyism. And state resources, and we see that in a country like India, but that's also a global phenomena, where state resources, which are essentially public resources, get converted into private resources. And the richest man who has seen this massive surge in his wealth in our country is a good example of that. So from the ports to the airports, you're actually looking at accumulation of wealth by one person, which is actually being funded both by the by the large banks, but also by conversion of public resources into private assets.
But still, we talk about 60% who became billionaires very recently. And pharmaceutical companies, pharmaceutical guys, maybe there'll be one or two, but 60 is an unbelievable figure.
Yeah.
If it is true, how come? What are their wealth creating opportunities which was there in the last 3 years when the entire country was in the lockdown?
I would say that we need to also look at the trend. My answer would be that if you look at the year before that, even then there has been a massive surge in the number of billionaires. So it is the number of billionaires have grown massively in the last few years in this country. So I would really say that it's the larger economic architecture where
it's a process.
It's a process. So it's not, see, what the pandemic is a particular time where what we are seeing is, as I talked of, the pharma and the vaccine billionaires, that's what we are calling them, but they're broadly the sector. But this is also the time where the majority of the population got devastated. They have moved into debt. And as you quoted from our report, which is essentially quoting from the government figures itself, that probably from 19 or 20 crore, we have now 35 crore people living in hunger. As in, just look at the government figure itself. Now it is acknowledging that in the last 2 to 3 years, almost 80 crore people have survived on the food provided by the government, which essentially means, as in they are surviving on it, which essentially means that they do not have enough resources for 3 square meals. So this is the time. So in a way, it's the contrast which is critical. Otherwise, the process of accumulation of wealth has continued.
So about the corporates, we know that government has been offering a lot of sops to them, right from the corporate tax cuts to the latest production related incentive schemes, where if you produce in India from mobile phones to whatnot, you will get big rebates. And a lot of economists have been saying that it's not yielding results. But is it fair to say that? Because right from the time of the corporate tax cuts, we had hurried implementation of GST, then we had the lockdown. So the economic conditions were not very friendly.
Jimmy, I would actually look at the question slightly differently. And let me give you my take. One, what does this corporate tax mean? The reduction in the corporate tax. The reduction of the corporate tax from 30 to 22.5% just for the year 20 to 21 meant revenue foregone of 1,03,000 crores. This is almost the resources needed to run the NREGA for almost 1.5 years. And as you know, that's probably the largest program in the world. And that is what gave the basic survival to the Indian population during the pandemic. So the point is, without getting into a debate about whether it's effective or not effective, what are the priorities of the government? and of our country. So the question is, do we focus on redistributive policies? Do we prioritize the poorest of the poor, or we invest in these corporates and hope and wait for a mythical trickle down, which has not happened in the last 40 years. So I would say, you can say that in the last 1 or 2 years, there have been massive issues. Yes, the pandemic obviously has been once in a century, probably even more in terms of the crisis. But look at since the 1990s, we have been talking of giving corporates serious incentives, and those incentives have been given. However, what you actually see is inequality growing in this country. So, that is the framing. I would very strongly urge us to, it's ultimately the question is majority of the population. How are they doing? Are they becoming better? What's happening to our education? What's happening to health? You talked of the pandemic. How did we perform during the pandemic? It was a good wake-up call for our health system. But I would say that the health system collapsed, and there are systemic reasons which are linked to the conversation we have. And I hope we can talk about that, because that's critical part of the solutions we have.
Generally, I accept to what you are saying, but 1.3 lakh crore, the figure, is it a little bit problematic?
I would not say that, as in, if you just look at the numbers, and this often comes from the government, as in the government budgets always had clearly highlighting what is the revenue foregone. So it's this one, I'm not very sure if we have got it from the budget. I can check and tell you. But the budget, government budget itself, every year tells you that what is the revenue foregone.
Yeah, I accept that. But that is how they calculate, is that what happened, what we got in the last year, and we have given them a rebate of this much percent. So what is lost? But what I'm trying to say is that the times have changed and it's a different scenario. And even if there was no such incentives, you may not have got that much corporate money as corporate tax. That's also possible.
We are here not in the business of technically arguing about fractions. The point being made here is, don't take that figure. The point is that you're looking at, these are again government data, that as we said, 80 crore people were surviving on the food provided by the government. On the other hand, we have seen a rise of number of billionaires. What is the intervention that's needed? Has the corporate tax yielded any reduction in the corporate tax, yielded any results in a direct benefit to these 80 crore people? I think that's really the question. As in, I would frame it like that. I'm not bothered. Let me clearly articulate my poor bias. I am talking of a perspective where the poor of this country, the majority of this country, is at the center of policy making. The policy making is not about corporates doing well, for me at least. They must do well, but not at the expense of the poor people. So I would not get into argument about whether it's 1,03,000 crores, or you say that it's 75,000 crores possible. And it was, yes, and a very, very difficult year for everyone.
There was a report by the credit sides last year about how Adani is richer, or how Adani may fall if something bad happens to his conglomerate. So there they were saying that Adani is a wealthy person, very huge wealth, but most of that wealth is based predominantly in stocks. And if there a crisis comes, he may not be in a position to cash out all of things, because that will trigger a panic selling and his shares will lose its value. So when we calculate the wealth of the billionaires, if we take into account their stocks, will that be a fair valuation?
It is important to look at multiplicity of factors, including, say, income inequality. But let me just say that it's sad that in India, you do not get the income numbers. So one appeal that I would make through you to the government and others would be that we do need numbers. And those numbers are not just about income. Let me also say that we are not looking at, now looking at a situation where you're just not getting the right data from the government sources. So whether it is NSSO, whether it is even now the census. Census was to be done in 21 and we are in 23 and we still don't know when the census is going to be done. Having said this, coming to your critique, I would just ask you in terms of the public narrative, as in my counter question to you would be, don't we as societies constantly celebrate these super wealthy based on their wealth and not on income? When every day in newspapers you say Adani has become the third richest person, are you then saying, no, this is not real wealth, let's not talk about it? So I would say it's important to acknowledge that this is also one way of looking at the wealth of the billionaires. Yes, what you're saying is correct, that this does fluctuate, and there's no doubt about it. However, the volumes are so enormous, the capital accumulation is so massive that we need to try and find ways of redistribution. So, the question that you're asking for me is still not touching the heart of the conversation. You're still, in a way, I would say, presenting the arguments from the perspective of critiquing the report, which is totally all right. I acknowledge that. But the point that we are making here is not about how to calculate wealth. But let me also say that, this is how wealth is also calculated across the world. It is not Oxfam, it is Credit Suisse which does that. It is Forbes which does that. Eventually, everybody talks of that wealth. And let's just move ahead. There are different ways of also taxing wealth. So in the United States, you have very serious inheritance laws, which does look at wealth broadly in the way we have visualized it. It doesn't say that your stocks will go down and therefore the taxes are going to be lower. You have serious inheritance tax in the US. In Spain, in Norway, you still have, in Switzerland, you actually have wealth tax. So you're taxing wealth, and there are different ways of taxing wealth. But the argument that because wealth can fluctuate, let's not talk about it. There are multiple arguments. Just look at the question of a poor person. When the poor person goes to get credit in the bank, you have to demonstrate that you have a collateral of 5 lakh. Is that not wealth? You'll say that it's speculative. You have a small piece of land, whether it will go up or down. So I would say, let's not continue on that line. This is also about bringing attention to the issue that we are highlighting. When we present a data that 20% of the unrealized gains for the richest person can support 5 million school teachers, we are not saying that it is the taxation should be 20%. I hope that's clear. It's just making the argument to say what is the level of wealth that's been generated and accumulated. The idea of redistribution is seen with both suspicion and it's maligned. As soon as you talk of redistribution, people get upset about it, and that's what I think. People get upset in terms of whenever a report comes out, they get upset because we are essentially talking of redistribution. So while you can create assets, I find it problematic when people juxtapose the inequality question with the question of poverty reduction. One of the questions that is again and again thrown at me is that, why are you talking of inequality and why not about poverty alleviation? So we do talk about poverty alleviation. It's critical, but we also realize that inequality is one of the structural causes of poverty. And if you don't address inequality, we'll not be able to address poverty.
We know that from 1990 or the late 1980s, the surge of the rich has started. And after 30 years, we have reached here. There was a promise when the liberalization era opened up that people will get more jobs, that trickle-down effect will really happen, and you will have big conglomerates which will fight in the international arena, and Indians will be getting more jobs, more money, and better living facilities. Where have we lost that thing?
I think that's really critical, that the shift that we made in the 90s started changing the character of the Indian state. And we moved away from, let me first focus on what we think is one of the most important drivers of an equal society, and that is investment in public services. So post 90s, we have actually looked at the starving of the public services, ranging from early childhood to education to health. And globally, there's enough research which tells us that more equal societies actually have greater investments in say, public education and public health. Let me just give you one data point, or let me two data points, because they're I think very, very critical to make the argument. In the last couple of years, India has been fourth from the bottom in terms of investments in public health. Globally, fourth from the bottom. Our investment in public health hovers around 1.25 to 1.3%. Whereas our peers in say BRICS, most of them are 3%, around 3%. And the developed countries are up to 8 to 9 to 10%. So that's the difference that you're looking at. And every government promises that we'll have 2 to 3% of GDP being invested in public health, and we do not go beyond 1.25 to 1.3%. What does it mean? One very concrete number that I'll give you, and this is really telling. The Human Development Index tells us that I think we are 157th amongst 165 countries in terms of bed availability per capita. And I'm particularly highlighting this because it makes an important point that in 2010, we had 9 beds per thousand population. And in 2020, it came down to only 5 beds. And this includes the private and the government services. So you can clearly see how starving of the public health system has resulted in poorer medical facilities, and very often it's the poor who suffer. Because on the other hand, you have super specialty hospitals, you are even doing medical tourism, you have the super rich coming from around the world to come and do 5-star hospitals, but it's the poor who are suffering. So, these are questions where we have really been hit massively. Education is not a different story. And on the other hand, just to add one more point, is the informalization of the labor that we're seeing. And that continues, and that's say the third piece of our demand. So if you look at for redistribution, we're essentially saying we need to tax the rich, wealth tax, inheritance tax, windfall gain tax on the one hand. The second is more serious investments in public health and public education and other public services. And the third is at least ensure minimum wages in also the informal sector, which does not happen, in the supply chains. And we are saying actually it should not be minimum wage, it should be a living wage, which even the ILO talks of, which will ensure a life of dignity for all.
In short, we were promised of something, maybe moon, but what happened is that filthy rich islands were created in the sea of poor. That's what happened. Actually, that's the story of the last 30 years.
The story of last 30 years is of an unequal growth, a growth which has lined the pocket of the super rich, where the poor have become poorer in terms of their access to services. This is also the time, as in now we are looking at a time where the levels of inequality and a lot of serious work is happening, which says that the political unrest that you see globally, the complete capture of democracy that you see by these crony capitals is essentially a reflection of the unequal growth trajectories that we have created. So we need to also understand that the consequences go beyond just the economic inequality. It goes to the social sphere, it goes to the political sphere. And you know what is interesting or rather surprising is that even entities like the World Bank and the IMF, which in many ways have been responsible for this unequal growth, are the ones who have now started saying these levels of inequality are unsustainable. In Sri Lanka, when after the economic crisis, when IMF was negotiating with the Sri Lankan government, it is talking of a wealth tax. So it's coming a full circle, but it is a difficult moment, I would say, not just for the economic inequality, but for the future of humanity. And sorry, Jimmy, just because, you know, I talked of future of humanity, let me just quickly add one more point, and that is about the question of climate justice. You know, that same top 1% that we've been talking of actually have twice the carbon emissions of the bottom 50%. That's the level of inequality, even in terms of responsibility for climate change.
The 30-year story, if we sum up in a different way, the government withdrew from a lot of areas where they were before. And the private investment never happened, or it happened exclusively for the people who could pay really, really well. So for some sectors, there are nobody, isn't it?
And that really goes back to the fundamental social contract, the social contract that every citizen has with his or her state. That I do think that in this country, after 75 years of independence, if I'm not able to still access basic primary health, then that social contract has not delivered for the majority of this country. So you're absolutely right that, you know, the seceding of the super rich. You can have your own schools, your own hospitals, your own water supply, even your own security now, law and order. You have your own security guards. So probably they're just using the public roads, and they've seceded from the country.
And about the Oxfam, this is not the first report which has created such a furrow. The last report, which was aptly titled, Inequality Kills. And after that, what happened to Oxfam? Oxfam India specifically, we know that. So as an organization who fights for inequality, has to fight for their own existence also.
We are here with a mission. Oxfam India believes in working towards an equal and discrimination-free India, and we'll continue working on it. As in our inequality report, we think is a very important message for everybody, from the government to the policymakers, to the corporates, to civil society, that we need to focus on the question of inequality. And we'll continue working on it. And we'll continue working on serving the communities. And hopefully, the regulations that the government has put on us in terms of us not being able to receive foreign resources, FCRA, they'll understand and appreciate that we are really contributing to nation building, and actually work with the messages that we're giving.
But still, Oxfam India is surviving, alive and kicking. how do people survive?
So, no, there are a lot of support which comes from Indians, and that's what is making us survive. But I must say that I'm absolutely sure that it's not just us. Many others who are driven by a core set of values of justice, of equality, of human dignity will continue the work. Yeah, I think that's our North Star. The Indian Constitution's preamble inspires us, and we'll continue striving towards the message in the preamble for us.
That's it, Mr. Behar. Thank you for talking to us, and thank you, viewers, for watching us. Thank you.
Thank you.